fuzzy when I made that title, and I think I should say systematic still a basic science. We've got several sciences here. I'd like to, at this time, thank the people who have organized this program. Any of you who have ever managed a program like this know that it takes a tremendous amount of coordination and effort behind the scenes to bring it off. And I think that your applause shows that you appreciate that too. Like Van, I'm not one of the originals. He was an original, and I'm not. Because I didn't arrive on the scene here until 1951, which was considerably after all this preliminary work, shall we say, concerning the society had taken place. So I can't be a party to any of that. But like Van, I started out in the Midwest. I am a Midwesterner, not an East Coaster. And after college, I had to think about what I was going to do. And among those things was to get a minor in education. I figured that I would be a teacher. You had to have it. So you wasted 20 hours taking education courses that maybe some of you have done that. Or maybe it was 24, I can't remember now. But anyway, I did become a high school teacher in biology and general science in southwest Kansas, and did that for 2 years. And at the end of that time, I thought I didn't really know enough to do a good job of teaching. Besides that, I wanted to get into a larger system that would pay a little bit more. I made $1,800. We talked about money all the way through these talks. I made $1,800 a year. If you went to western Kansas, you could get $300 more a year than if you taught in eastern Kansas. No one wanted to live in western Kansas. And I got a raise to $2,100 the second year, so that was a pretty good percentage raise. Anyway, I decided to go back to graduate school and learn enough to be a halfway decent teacher. I didn't know anything about research at that time. I didn't even know it existed, to tell you the truth. All I knew was subject matter that would be taught in classrooms and that sort of thing. So when I arrived at the University of Kansas, I had no idea what I should embark upon. And I was introduced to Professor Byron Leonard. He was a prince. He knew intuitively my trouble. He was from western Oklahoma, and he'd gone through the same thing. But he suggested to me that I might want to work on a crayfish problem in the Ozarks. And I said, fine. Didn't make any difference to me. I had to have a research project of some kind. And so I embarked then on 5-year studies of crayfishes in Kansas first, and then in the Ozarks. And he was my field companion all of that time. Of course, I was helping him too, but we worked together. And so there was a considerable amount of field work amassing that collection. There was a collection at the University of Kansas, but it was old. It had been collected 40 years earlier by a man named Harris, and part of it had been lost. So I had to put together a collection that I could work with systematically, because Kansas is a school of taxonomy. Still is. So I did that, and at the end of getting the collection together and studying them, I knew that I had to get to a large museum somewhere to see what had been done before by the experts who had written the monographs. And so that meant go to the United States National Museum and also the MCZ at Harvard, where most of the crayfishes were. There were smaller collections in Oklahoma and 1 or 2 other places, but I had to see to it that I got to those places. I didn't have any money. How would I get there? I was a teaching assistant. Didn't get much money from that. And so what I did was, the department chairman E. Raymond Hall prevailed on me and one other of the graduate students to fulfill one of the requirements of the degree at campus. You had to spend the summer term in a marine station to get a PhD. Originally, I thought that I would just take a master's, but my professor prevailed on me to forget the master's. After I'd been there a year, go for the big one. And you have to drop back to do that. Well, I decided to do that and to go to Woods Hole because the university maintained a table there, and there hadn't been any students from Kansas to go to the MBO for a long time. So I did that, and if I did that, I could combine the trip to USNM and Harvard in the same thing and do a little better financially. So I did that. And when I was at the National Museum, I met the grand old man, one of the grand old men of crustacean biology, Waldo Smith. And he was another friend who, in his long career, I think partly because of the death of his son during World War II, he liked to do things for young men who might become professional biologists. And so he encouraged me in every way that he could. And I thank him for that. Well, finally, after visiting those museums and, of course, finishing a dissertation, 1951, long after AERS was established. When I got out of school in 1951, jobs were almost non-existent. Every veteran that was in World War II was looking for jobs. I found two. I took the first one, because the second didn't come till much later. The first one was to come to Morehead City and take a job as a shrimp investigator. I didn't know what that was either. But they wanted someone that was not overridden by prejudicial thoughts about what ought to be done in studying the shrimps in North Carolina. Well, they certainly got one, but not prejudiced. And so, without this, Nelson, you said it, this was a good old boy network. No interview, nothing but a letter, in which I wrote, of course, and introduced myself to the then director of the Institute of Marine Sciences, a man named Bill Ellison. Bill Ellison was a colleague of Harvard Taylor. And I think he wrote one of the chapters in that book, I'm not sure. Maybe not. But anyway, that was it. And how did Bill Ellison find me? From Waldo Smith. He was a personal friend of Waldo. So, it wasn't that hard. And for me, that was Portsmouth. It worked. So, I came to Morehead, and new experience, never been in the deep south before, although I had grown up in Missouri, which was kind of a middle border state, and arrived on the scene and found that really this job was essentially, as Gene Cronin said in the TV show that we saw here yesterday, a fisheries job. That's what those jobs were right after World War II. They were focused on fisheries. The state needed to develop industry. And so we were supposed to be the players that helped to bring that about. And we did that to the best of our ability after some really independent research on what we should do. It turned out what I did was to find out what the life history of the three species that made up the commercial catch in this state were. That wasn't really fully known up until then. When the large post-larvae came in from the ocean, underwent a period of development here in the Sounds, and then went back to sea. It didn't take very long to find that out, about a year, but I didn't know whether it was the same every year, and I didn't know really what the post-larvae looked like. I suppose that was the main contribution I could make there, was to find out what did they look like. And I was able to separate them and keep them out, and know, therefore, when they arrived, how long they stayed, and when they left. Of course, in doing that, I was getting a lot of other shrimps as well. And they weren't always easy to identify either. The only publication we had in those days, bona fide publication, was Hay and Shore. They figured it was published by W.P. Hay, who was the high school teacher of Washington, D.C., C.A. Shore, a man who worked for the state health department here. That had been published in 1918, so here I was, 30 years later, essentially, looking at these shrimps. And in the back of my mind, it kept nagging me that there was not any better publication around than handling with identified crustacean, very prominent group. And it obviously had shortcomings. And so I thought, okay, maybe I should try to beef this up a little bit. And it was about that time that all of the laboratories up and down the coast were doing work of that kind. This was not anything that I had done. The labs were new. Here was BIMS, started in an old garage that they took over and tried to make into a viable laboratory. The Institute of Marine Sciences in Morehead City was a part of the Naval Coast Guard Hospital. And the various states up and down the line were dealing with these temporary structures, if you want to say it that way, in which they could get the building almost free, hire a few young scientists, and try to carry on the research. We didn't have much of a library. We didn't have very many instruments. We got a few as we could, and moved forward from that. But from that period, a number of publications of this type that I was thinking about date. Now, Duke had one, has one. Checklist of marine invertebrates. It's gone through many editions. I don't know how many now. Anybody here in Duke know? I suppose 20 or 25. Changed a little bit every year. I.E. Gray was one of the early developers of that, invertebrate zoologist here. In Virginia, later on, Marvin Wass came along and did that same thing. See, there was no overall reference to which you could, on which you could depend. So all of these people did that. I suppose one of the most outstanding of those was what Mel Carrier started when he went to Massachusetts and started the marine flora and fauna of northeastern United States, which is a superb series of monographs, really, to which many of you possibly have contributed. And I don't know, Mel, whether that is finished now or does it still go on?
Still going on.
Still going on. Well, that's the sort of thing that got started in that general time frame and has been a boon to coastal science all the way along. Well, Beaufort here at the Institute of Marine Sciences did that same thing for mollusks. And he tells me that a new edition of that, I believe it is coming out. So many people have worked at things of this kind, giving us a better idea of what the fauna is. And I did that with the Decapod crustacean in 1965, and that very soon was out of date. Now, it was published by the National Marine Fisheries Service because I had to look for a publisher, and everybody always thinks that I worked with the National Marine Fisheries at that time. I didn't. I do now, but I didn't then. But in doing that piece of work, I found myself having to go to a source of information that is irreplaceable. This was the National Museum. I'd been there before as a graduate student. I had to go, spend time, sometimes 2 or 3 weeks at a time, making the comparisons. You have to look at the types, you've got to look at things that are authoritative individuals have authenticated in time past, in which you have confidence. You can't do it de novo, and you can't just read some paper and be sure that the person that wrote that paper really knew what they were talking about. So the comparison with these simple collections is absolutely essential if you're going to do good taxonomic work. So I did that. Biodiversity lists. I'm out of AERS statistic now. I'm trying to look forward to what we want to do. Biodiversity lists are hard to develop. They have to depend on publications, but they're working in the National Museum, so they do have some counsel. And they have the literature, superb library to go by. And all of this will be electronically recorded. There will be keys in it that one can use eventually and use that as a taxonomic aid. There's little real backing and funds of it. There's been a lot of talk. There is not a lot of real action to support that. But I know some of the young people that are working on that. Now here's a disturbing thought. A lot of these model surveys are contracted out to people in the, shall we say, biodiversity business. I don't know what else to call it. Texas Instruments might be one of those. Mary Beaufort and some of those people. And they say that nearly 30% of the material that they get from their samples is unidentifiable. I don't mean that it's been run through a Japsco pump and forced through a screen. I mean that they have no way of identifying it. They've never been described. This is material that people have never looked at critically. Now that's not the larger decapod crustaceans, although there are problems there too yet, or fishes, or any of these groups. In other words, the longer we get into these studies and the more deeply we get into them, the more we realize that there are subtle differences that need more study. That means comparison with good collections in a research-grade museum. And that's, in this country, mainly the National Museum of Natural History. So I'm really saying to you, don't overlook that resource. People, I think, don't go there because they don't realize that they can go, it's yours, you own it, the United States owns it. They're well curated, it's the best curated museum in the world, and I've been in a bunch of them. And there are people there who can help you if you need it. So if you're going to do reliable taxonomy, make sure that you have compared with something that stands as a standard for you. That's my, I don't know whether it's advice, it's my plea to young scientists who are doing that type of work to use that resource. I get stuff from all over the world, of course, in a job like I'm in now at the National Museum. And, yeah, 30% comes in, I can't do anything with it either, because either the material is not there, we don't have an all-encompassing collection there. I've got 4 crabs in Argentina right now on my table that a man wants me to confirm that it was the species I described with an Argentinian scientist 4 years ago from La Plata. Well, that's one of the common crabs on that beach. It's been there forever. Nobody ever thought to describe it. They just left it there and called it Sonoma. Didn't do anything with it. And I don't think any of these things that you sent to me are Sonoma. So now I've got to get in there and dig to find out what it is, so that he can do something with it. So that's the function of a place like that. And there are other museums in the world, great ones, Paris, London, and so on. So I think that I'll stop with that. I'm going to look to the future.